Europe in the early 19th century, a continent that, for over 2 decades, lived under the colossal shadow of a single man, Napoleon Bonaparte. His rise was meteoric. From an artillery officer in Corsica, he became the emperor of the French, reshaping maps, toppling ancient monarchs, and forging an empire that stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to Russia. His military campaigns, marked by spectacular victories like Austerlitz and Jena, redefined the art of war in European politics. He was a military genius, a brilliant administrator, but also a ruthless despot whose ambition seemed boundless. However, even the most vast empires have their breaking points. The disastrous campaign in Russia in 18, with its brutal winter and scorched earth tactics, marked the beginning of the end. Subsequent defeats at the Battle of the Nations in Leipzig in 18, and the Allied invasion of France in 1814, forced Napoleon to abdicate. He was exiled to the small island of Elba in the Mediterranean, a destiny that, for many, decisively sealed the Napoleonic chapter in history. Europe, exhausted by years of constant wars, breathed a sigh of relief. The victorious monarchs gathered at the Congress of Vienna, attempting to redraw the continent and restore the old order, as if the French Revolution and Napoleon's empire had never existed. But peace was fragile, and the shadow of the former emperor still loomed. In Elba, Napoleon, restless and aware of the divisions among the Allies in Vienna, wasn't an ordinary prisoner. He observed, planned, and waited for the right moment. France under the restored Bourbon monarchy, with Louis XVIII on the throne, wasn't what the people expected. There was dissatisfaction, unemployed war veterans, and the memory of Napoleonic glory still pulsed. Then, on February 26, 1815, something that seemed impossible happened. Napoleon escaped from Elba with a handful of loyal guards. He landed in France on March 1st. His march to Paris was triumphant. Troops sent to stop him, many of them veterans of his campaigns, simply joined him. Turning their bayonets and embracing their ancient leader, King Louis XVIII fled, and in just 20 days, without firing a single significant shot, Napoleon victoriously entered Paris, reclaiming power. The 100 Days had begun. News of Napoleon's escape and return hit the European powers like an electric shock. The Congress of Vienna, which was about to finalize its work, was suddenly thrown into chaos. European leaders, Great Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, declared Napoleon an outlaw and a disturber of world peace. It was an unequivocal declaration of war. They quickly formed the Seventh Coalition, mobilizing their armies with a single purpose: to crush Napoleon once and for all. There would be no negotiations, only war. Napoleon knew time was crucial. He couldn't wait for the enormous coalition armies to unite and invade France. His only chance was to attack them separately before they could coordinate their movements. He turned his attention to the 2 closest armies. Stationed in Belgium, the British and Allied forces under the command of the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussian army, led by Marshal Gebhard Leberecht. This was swift and audacious. Invade Belgium, defeat Wellington and Blucher in separate battles, and thus dismantle the coalition before it could consolidate. The stage was set for the final confrontation, and the fate of Europe would hang in the balance in Belgium. With time running out, Napoleon needed to be swift and decisive. His plan was brilliant in its audacity: to divide the Allied armies before they could unite their overwhelming forces. Wellington's British and Allied troops, around 93,000 men, were spread across forward posts, while approximately 116,000 men, were to the southeast, more concentrated. Napoleon, with his Army of the North, around 125,000 men, intended to strike the center of the Allied lines, at the junction of the 2 armies, to push them in opposite directions. The campaign began on June 15, 1815, when Napoleon crossed the Belgian border, catching the Allies by surprise. His scouts were so effective that Wellington, who was at a ball in Brussels, received the news of the first contacts with a considerable delay. Speed was the essence of the French plan. The first major clash occurred on June 16th. Napoleon divided his forces. He himself led the main attack against the Prussians at Ligny, while Marshal Ney, his brave but sometimes impetuous commander, was tasked with holding back Wellington's forces at the strategic crossroads of Cottebras. At Ligny, Napoleon achieved a significant tactical victory. Blucher's Prussian troops were heavily battered and forced to retreat. Blucher, a 72-year-old veteran known for his ferocity, was even injured during the battle, and his horse was killed beneath him. For a brief moment, the French believed Prussia was out of action, scattered and in disorderly retreat eastward, towards their base. This was a crucial and mistaken interpretation. Meanwhile, at Cottebras, the battle was a bloody stalemate. Ney, who had ambiguous orders and a crucial army corps under which spent the day marching between the 2 battlefields without effectively participating in either, failed to dislodge Wellington. The British and Allied forces, though outnumbered initially, resisted with tenacity, holding the vital crossroads. Ney's inability to crush Wellington allowed the Allied troops to withdraw in good order. On the morning of June 17th, with the Prussians supposedly retreating eastward, Napoleon sent Marshal Grouchy, with about 33,000 men and 100 cannons, to pursue the Prussians and prevent them from regrouping and supporting Wellington. Blucher, despite his defeat at Ligny, had not retreated east. He had retreated north toward Wavre, maintaining contact with Wellington and planning to join him. Blucher's determination, who despite his advanced age and fall, was more furious than ever. This was a decisive factor. Wellington, upon learning of the Prussian defeat at Ligny, ordered a retreat from Cottebras to a carefully chosen defensive position south of the village of Waterloo. He knew he needed a strong position to face Napoleon, and was counting on Blucher's promise to march to his aid. The battlefield of Waterloo was a gentle ridge, but with strong points like the fortified farms of Hougoumont-la-Haye-Sainte and the village of Plancy, which would serve as crucial defensive anchors. The torrential rain that fell on the night of June 17th transformed the field into a muddy quagmire, delaying the movement of troops and artillery, but setting the stage for the epic confrontation the next day, with Wellington's and Blucher's armies apparently separated, but in truth conspiring to unite, and Grouchy pursuing the enemy in the wrong direction. The stage was set for the battle that would seal the fate of Napoleon in Europe. It was June 18, 1815. The day dawned cloudy and damp, the battlefield transformed into a muddy swamp by the torrential rain of the previous night. The mud, though an inconvenience for troop movement, was a crucial factor that delayed Napoleon's initial attack, preventing his powerful artillery from maneuvering and firing efficiently early in the day. This small window of time gave Wellington and his allies a certain advantage. The battlefield of Waterloo was dominated by a raised ridge, where Wellington positioned his troops. His strategy was defensive, taking advantage of the terrain as natural slopes and fortified strong points to shield his troops from enemy fire and surprise. French advances. The crucial points of this defensive line were the fortified farms, a large walled rural estate on Wellington's right flank, and La Haye-Sainte, a smaller farm and a critical forward post in the center of the line. On the French right flank, opposite the approaching Prussian left flank, was the village of Plancy. Napoleon, from the heights of La Belle Alliance Hill, surveyed the field. He awaited the arrival of Prussian reinforcements for Grouchy and underestimated Wellington's ability to hold the line. Around 11:30 a.m. the first French attack was launched against Hougoumont. This wasn't Napoleon's main assault, but a diversion to force Wellington to move his reserves to the flank. What followed, however, was a brutal and prolonged combat that would last all day. Thousands of French soldiers were hurled against Hougoumont's walls, defended with tenacity by British and Allied guards. The farm became an impregnable fortress, draining valuable French resources and tying down a significant portion of Napoleon's army in a secondary engagement. In the early afternoon, Napoleon ordered a massive infantry attack against the center of Wellington's line, near La Haye. Derlin's infantry division, with about 16,000 men, advanced in dense columns. However, these formations were vulnerable to artillery in the famous British defensive line, which offered devastating frontal fire. The British cavalry, including the notable heavy dragoons, launched a spectacular disorganizing the French columns and causing enormous casualties. Still in the mid-afternoon, the battlefield changed drastically. Ney's French infantry, in a series of misunderstandings and impulses, launched successive massive cavalry charges against the British and Allied infantry. Waves of thousands of French cavalrymen, including the legendary cuirassiers, charged Wellington's lines. The British, however, formed their famous infantry squares, impenetrable defensive formations, with bayonets pointed in all directions, turning into steel hedgehogs. The French charges, though terrifying, broke against these squares, suffering terrible losses from musket and artillery fire. Meanwhile, on the French right flank, the situation became desperate for Napoleon. Blucher's Prussians, despite exhaustion and mud, were keeping their promise. Around 4:30 p.m., the first Prussian troops, led by General Buell, began to arrive at the village of Plancenoit on the French army's right flank. Their arrival was a turning point. Napoleon was forced to divert important contingents of his Imperial Guard to contain the Prussians, who threatened his flank and line of retreat. The fighting in Plancenoit was a brutal massacre, with the French Imperial Guard fighting desperately to hold the position. In the late afternoon, with exhaustion gripping both sides, Napoleon made his last move. He unleashed his legendary Imperial Guard, the elite of his army, until then undefeated, in a final assault against the center of Wellington's line. In a dramatic moment, the guardsmen advanced up the slope, believing victory was within reach. But Wellington, who had concealed his troops behind the ridge, ordered, "Up, guards!" and at M. The Imperial Guard was met by a massive volley of musket and artillery fire, suffering terrible casualties. For the first time in history, the Imperial Guard the cry of the Guard retreats spread among the French troops, shattering their morale. At the same time, Blucher launched the final Prussian attack on Napoleon's right flank, crushing French resistance in Plancenoit and advancing toward the center of the battlefield. The conjunction of Wellington's and Blucher's troops, who met near La Belle Alliance, sealed Napoleon's fate. the French army disintegrated into a chaotic rout. The emperor, seeing imminent defeat, attempted to position himself to die in combat, but was convinced to flee to avoid capture. The Battle of Waterloo was over. June 18, 1815, witnessed not just the end of a battle, but the collapse of an empire and the definitive end to the trajectory of one of history's greatest military strategists. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo wasn't merely a tactical setback. It was the final blow to his ambition to reshape Europe under his rule. Napoleon, the man who had defied monarchies and armies for over 2 decades, saw his dream crumble. That day he sought death in combat, attempting to throw himself into the chaos of the last charges, but was convinced by his generals to flee to avoid ignominious capture by the Prussians, who promised no mercy. He managed to escape the battlefield, but his power was already a mirage. 3 days after the battle, on June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second and final time. This time, there was no more Elba. The Allied powers, determined to remove his threat definitively, were sighted on a much more distant and isolated exile. The remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. There, under British surveillance, he would spend his final years, dictating memoirs and reflecting on a past of glory and defeat, until his death in 1821. The consequences of Waterloo were vast and immediate for Europe. The Congress of Vienna, which had been interrupted by Napoleon's escape, could finally conclude its work, redrawing the continent's map and establishing a new order. Great Britain emerged as the world's leading naval and economic power, and Prussia gained significant strength, paving the way for its future German unification. France in turn returned to the Bourbon monarchy, but the seeds of revolutionary and liberal ideas, spread by Napoleonic conquests, had already been sown and would continue to influence the 19th century. The end of the Napoleonic Wars brought a period of relative peace to Europe known as the Pax Britannica, often informally referred to as the 100 Years' Peace in terms of major European conflicts which would last until World War I. This allowed for a renewed focus on industrial, technological, and social development. Political stability, though often enforced by conservative regimes, created an environment for economic growth and the advance of the Industrial Revolution, especially in Great Britain. Napoleon's military innovations, though he himself was defeated, would continue to be studied and adapted by armies worldwide, shaping tactics and strategies for decades. Furthermore, Napoleon's defeat had an unexpected benefit for the development of liberal and nationalist thought. Although the restored monarchs in Vienna attempted to suppress these ideas, the legacy of the French Revolution and Napoleon himself, who despite being a despot abolished feudalism, implemented unified legal codes, and promoted administrative reforms in many places, continued to inspire movements for freedom and the fight against the tyrant Napoleon reinforced the idea of nationhood and the desire for constitutions and individual rights in various countries. Waterloo, therefore, wasn't just a battle. It was a turning point. It ended an era of incessant conflicts driven by the ambition of a single man and opened the doors to a new geopolitical landscape. It was the end of the Napoleonic era, but the beginning of a new phase for Europe, with challenges and transformations that would shape the modern world. The image of Napoleon, the military genius who finally met his limit, remains etched in history, a vivid reminder that even the greatest empires and the grandest ambitions can, in the end, meet their water. The Battle of Waterloo was a turning point that sealed an emperor's fate and reshaped the map of Europe. What aspect of this epic battle surprised you most? Do you believe Napoleon's defeat was inevitable? Or was there a moment when history could have taken a different turn? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if there is another fascinating historical event or legendary figure you'd like us to explore in our next video, leave your suggestion below. Your curiosity is our guide.